Hello and welcome to my channel. I am heading towards the wharf for our 20-minute cruise along the Harbourside of Port Arthur. This is a part of the tour that I paid for. So I am taking you to this cruise, and there will be a commentary that most of you will be listening to, so you can really immerse into the history of this place, which is interesting and quite informative. And so I am sharing this experience with you, so hope you will enjoy and you'll get something out of it. You can comment if you like. But yes, we are now going on a cruise. We are now boarding. So as I said, this is a 20-minute cruise. Also, just to let you know that this is going to be an immersive experience for me. We have now slowly moved away from the wharf, and soon we will be hearing from a commentator. During this cruise, this 20-minute cruise, there will be a complimentary site talk at key locations through the journey.
What were considered to be the most incorrigible or incurable criminals within this colony of Van Diemen's Land. Now, the general scheme of this place, of course, was that men would be put to hard labour gathering raw materials, and other men would be put to task making things from those raw materials. Port Arthur always had an industrial side. Now, the most plentiful and most valuable raw material here was timber. Various species of eucalypts, whale boats. Whaling was a major industry in this early colony of Van Diemen's Land, so you can imagine craft like that being in big demand, and ships would travel from all over the world to hunting these very fertile waters. A longboat is a very similar craft, but they were used to transport goods and personnel around the bays and inlets of this early colony, when travel across country was often quite difficult, if not totally impossible. But they built larger ships as well. The largest ship built at Port Arthur was 286 tons. She was also the largest ship built in the colony at that point in time. What you can see sitting in one of the old slipways is an artist's sculptural representation of one of those craft under construction. Now, the operation at the dockyard was fairly independent of the rest of Port Arthur. They had their own blacksmith shops where they could make their own metal fittings and fastenings. They had their own saw pits. They used to use steamers. Steamers allowed the timbers to be heated up, makes them more pliable so they can be bent to the appropriate shapes. At the back of that complex was a big shed where they used to cut and sew the canvas sails, as well as make up the rigging. And of course, all of this was under the watchful eye of a master. Now, there was never a problem with the quality or quantity of produce here. The major problem was the ships were very well built, but they were also very cheaply built. They were often sold on the open market for what would be, for a private shipwright, almost cost price. And you can understand that these private entrepreneurs were a bit upset by that. They protested through the Lieutenant Governor's Department and finally had their case heard. But they couldn't compete with convict labour in a settlement like this. So eventually the dockyard was closed down in 1848 you just hop onto the road above the jetty, walk along a nice tree-lined avenue if you were there. I recommend take your camera because there are some lovely images to be captured looking out across the bay. It was around 12 to 15, but the youngest of them were only 9 years of age. They were the pickpockets, the petty thieves, who came from the larger industrial towns of Great Britain, but the majority seemed to have come from London and the London districts. And they were the artful dodgers, but very much the real thing. People are often appalled at the fact that they were transporting children as young as 9, but the sadder fact is that the age of responsibility in Britain at this time was age 7. Boy or girl caught and convicted could be thrown into jail at that age, but the problem was it was the same jails for everybody, men, women and children. These places were grossly overcrowded, they were rife with corruption, and the thinking people of the day figured that these young people were actually learning more about the ways of crime within the walls of the prison than they were on the outside. They called these places universities of crime. A similar circumstance with boys being transported to Van Diemen's Land and spending considerable time in the Hobart barracks in contact with established criminals. So the idea of Point Poor was born, and ably assisted by his commandant, Captain Charles O'Hara Booth, he set about trying to change the system. The idea, of course, prime purpose was to keep the boys well away from the corrupting influence of adult convicts, and particularly those at Port Arthur. They could be taught how to read and write, basic arithmetic, taught trades like carpentry, boot and shoe making, barrel making, a bit of boat building in the early days, stone cutting. Now most of this stonework in the Port Arthur Church and Military Guard Tower would have been carved by these boys, and we assume it's the rougher work that you'll see on the inside of these buildings rather than the finer work on the facings. Of course, they received religious instruction as well. This was moral reformation, and it was compulsory throughout the entire convict system. Now, once a boy was considered suitable, he could then be taken to a hiring depot, which was out at Newtown, and from there distributed throughout the colony as a useful worker. So they were trying to steer the boys onto a different path, and with their new trade, they're hoping they won't resort to their old trade again and would become an integrated member of the society of these new colonies. Some boys certainly grasped that opportunity, unfortunately others didn't. For them it was hard labour, solitary confinement, deprivation of rations and corporal punishment. Corporal punishment was part of Point Poor, but thankfully never to the degree that it was applied back at the main settlement of Port Arthur. As we go past this little beach, you can see a stone wall. That's where the sawpits were, and up through the bush you can see a few foundations and footings. This is all that remains of what was quite a large establishment. Most of the buildings had stone or brick foundations, but the upper parts were made out of timber. And when they abandoned this site in the 1840s, they actually dismantled the buildings and recycled the raw materials. Problems with Point Poor was about resources and the fact that it was such a cold, windswept place. All resources had to be taken over there, and this includes water even, all the materials for their trades, rations, etc. So this almost guaranteed contact between the boys and convicts who were performing that task, and the thriving black market would grow because of that, tobacco being the main currency of course. But it's a very important historic site, the first sanctioned juvenile prison under British control. Historic site, of course, is the small island. This is Isle of the Dead, or as convicts like to call it, Dead Island. They were certainly in possession of a less romantic view than the authorities of this place. will last resting place for around 1,100 people. The majority of those, as you can imagine, are convicts. Expanse, which is the Southern Ocean. The cliffs of Point Poor, of course, are quite prominent as well, and boys would scramble down those cliffs and gather on the rocks out of view, and they would light fires, cook potatoes that they'd stolen, catch fish, smoke tobacco. Thomas Lombiere, the commissariat here, stood on top of the cliff and looked down. He said they scuttled away like little crabs. If you look towards Isle of the Dead once more and put an imaginary line down the centre of that, the left-hand side is the southern end, convicts, etc. But the right-hand side of the island, the higher ground, was reserved for burial of free people. These were members of the military, civilian establishment, and members of their families. About 180 men, women and children, and given their status, due burial in a lot of cases, some quite beautifully carved headstones as well. Maybe able to catch a glimpse of some of those as we go past. So two distinctly different cemeteries within the one island, a high ground for the free, a low ground for the bond. The small island was selected and named by the Wesleyan minister, the Reverend John Manton, in 1833, who described it as a secure and undisturbed resting place for those departed prisoners may lie. Cause of the compares favourably with the rest of the colony of Van Diemen's land. Life was hard for all people. The difference is that Port Arthur was designed to be hard. A punishment station. Work accidents were fairly frequent. Men working in the timber gangs or quarries suffer fatal accidents, men hit by falling trees and branches and so on. These men were wearing leg irons, which meant if anything went wrong, they didn't have much opportunity to get out of the way of falling branches and trees. Drownings were fairly common. It was a time in here many people could swim, and there was always a lot of activity on or around water. If somebody fell into the water, even people around them may not be able to assist them. Respiratory diseases affected convicts here. Tuberculosis affected convict and free person alike. They called it consumption, and it was the scourge of the 19th century. Diet-related diseases affected convicts. By the 1830s, over 70% of the convicts here were affected by scurvy. Reason being that their own private vegetable gardens were scrapped out, and the diet then was just a lump of meat and a lump of bread. Now scurvy flared up fairly quickly, and their remedy was to plant huge communal gardens on the flat ground in front of the church. They produced copious amounts of potatoes and turnips, in particular cabbages. One season here they produced over 10,000 cabbages, and that was essentially the end of scurvy. And what vegetables they didn't use fresh, they used to pickle. Pickled vegetables is very good because vinegar is good for scurvy as well. Among the women on the island, the most common cause of death seems to have been childbirth. And on behalf of crew and captain, I wish you an interesting and pleasant day. Thank you.